The morning sun had barely kissed the marble spires of the royal palace when a hush fell over the corridors. Servants paused mid-step, courtiers exchanged weary glances, and even the palace guards, hardened by decades of protocol, felt the prickling of unease in the air. It was as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. At the heart of the palace, in a room gilded with gold leaf and draped in crimson velvet, lay the prince. Only 4 years old, he slept in a bronze cradle engraved with the sigils of every generation of the kingdom, the metal warm from the rising sun. But it was not the prince's face that captured the court's attention that morning. It was the message that had arrived overnight, delivered by a trembling courier. Quote, "If the only prince dies, every other child in the palace will die." Unquote. The words had spread faster than wildfire, setting the palace ablaze with fear. The queen clutched the letter as though it were a living thing, her knuckles white against the parchment. She had read the prophecy countless times in hidden chronicles, but it had always been dismissed as legend, an old warning meant to frighten ambitious heirs. Now, written in ink as black as midnight, it felt dangerously real. Prince Malik stirred in his cradle, his small fingers curling around the satin blanket. A nursemaid hovered anxiously, brushing back his dark curls and whispering assurances he could not yet understand. The other children of the palace, royal cousins, wards, and protégés, played quietly in distant halls, unaware that their lives were tethered to the fragile beat of one small heart. In the shadowed corners of the palace, whispers began to grow into rumors. "It's the curse," some said. "The last prince of his line is the anchor of the palace," others muttered. Courtiers who had once laughed at tales of old magic now crossed themselves as they passed the nursery. Even the head of the royal guard, a man who had seen a dozen battles, felt an unfamiliar knot in his stomach. Meanwhile, Ilara, a young palace servant no older than 15, watched from behind the gilded screens. She had grown up in these halls, seeing the prince every day, but never had she felt such a weight pressing on the air. She knew the children were in danger, though she did not yet understand why. As she listened to the muffled voices and hurried footsteps, a chill ran down her spine. Something about this prophecy felt like more than a threat. It was a warning that the palace itself seemed to echo. And in the bronze cradle, Prince Malik's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, the world paused as his gaze met the darkness outside the nursery door. Somewhere in the palace, the children slept, unaware that their fates were now entwined with his. Somewhere, in the silent shadows, the curse waited. By midday, the palace was a hive of uneasy activity. Servants scurried along the corridors, their footsteps hollow against the polished marble floors. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, voices dripping suspicion and fear. And yet, amid the unrest, the children of the palace went about their play, oblivious, or perhaps willfully blind to the invisible threat that now hovered over them like a predator circling in the high rafters. Ilara moved quietly through the halls, her eyes constantly darting toward the closed doors of the children's quarters. Something had shifted overnight. The nursery, once a haven of laughter and lullabies, felt wrong. Shadows seemed to pool in corners where none should exist, stretching their fingers across the walls like dark ink. Even the air smelt heavier, tinged with copper and candle smoke, carrying whispers she could not yet understand. It began subtly. At first, one child, Prince Malik's cousin, a lively boy named Tariq, disappeared for a few hours, only to return pale, trembling and muttering about a hallway that had moved while he slept. Then came Amina, the youngest ward of the palace, who had been reading by a sunlit window. She returned, her eyes wide with terror, claiming she had been pulled through a door that did not exist. By evening, the rumors were no longer whispers. They were a rising tide of fear that crested even the stoic walls of the council chambers. The queen summoned her trusted aides. She said, her voice tight, Something is happening to the children, and it begins in the wing that has been sealed for generations, the Silk Ward. The Silk Ward had long been abandoned, locked away after a scandal that no one dared to speak about aloud. Its doors, carved from ebony and inlaid with silver, were rumored to be cursed. The last occupants had disappeared without a trace, and the corridors were walled off, draped in heavy silk to hide the entryways. But now, those same doors whispered again. Ilara had been assigned, along with 2 older attendants, to monitor the children, a task she undertook with reluctant courage. As she passed the ward's massive doors, a draft brushed her cheek, a sigh from the darkness beyond. It smelt faintly of smoke and rain, of things long buried. She shivered, gripping her lantern tighter, and moved on, though the feeling of being watched did not leave her. Night fell, and with it came the first real panic. Tariq disappeared again, this time for nearly an hour. When he returned, he was dragging his feet, his skin cold and clammy. It's the silk, he whispered. It calls to you. I don't know how, but it pulls you inside. The palace guard tried to investigate, but even they were ill-equipped to face the unnatural. Doors that were firmly locked opened of their own accord, hallways twisted like ribbons in the dark, and shadows seemed to have minds of their own. The children's play turned frantic, whispers of fear threading through every corridor. Ilara, heart pounding, realized that the Silk Ward was more than a relic of old secrets. It was alive. Not with breath or blood, but with memory and hunger. Every time a child wandered too close, it remembered them, remembered the laughter, the innocence, and the ties that bound them to the prince, and it wanted them. In the dead of night, she crept toward the ward, drawn by a pull she did not understand. Through the slitted moonlight, she saw the faint shimmer of silk curtains moving as though touched by invisible fingers. And then she heard it, a faint melodic hum that made the hairs on her arms rise. It was calling her, and somewhere deep in her bones she knew that the ward would not let her or any of the children leave unscathed. And back in his bronze cradle, Prince Malek slept on, unaware that the threads of fate were tightening around his cousins and companions. The Silk Ward, long dormant, had begun to awaken. Shadows slipped through its corridors like living water, curling around doorways, brushing past walls, whispering promises and threats that no child could comprehend. Elara's resolve hardened. If the ward was alive, then it could be confronted. If it hungered, then it could be outwitted. The palace had always survived threats from men with swords and kings with ambition. But tonight, it faced something far older, something that did not belong to the world of flesh and blood. And as the wind howled outside the sealed doors, carrying the soft creak of silk, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. If the children of the palace were to survive, she would have to understand the ward's secrets before it was too late. The palace had not slept in 3 nights. The halls that once echoed with laughter now hummed with an uneasy tension, like a string pulled tight and ready to snap. Servants whispered in corners. Parents, both royal and not, clutched their children with trembling hands. And even the guards, seasoned and stoic, avoided the corridors where the shadows seemed thickest. Prince Malek, the center of the storm, fell ill on the 4th day. At first it was subtle, a slight pallor, a faint cough, but within hours his temperature spiked, and the bronze cradle that had once glimmered in the morning sun now seemed to glow with a fevered light. The nursemaid cried silently as she fanned him, murmuring prayers that no one dared say aloud. The queen, stricken with fear, ordered that no one leave his side. Elara, who had been secretly watching the Silk Ward, now found herself pressed into service at the prince's bedside. Her small hands trembled as she helped soothe him, but her mind raced with questions. The prophecy had been clear. If the prince died, every other child in the palace would die. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the words were only half the truth. There was something more, something hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It was then that the healer arrived, a figure wrapped in deep indigo robes, her hair streaked with silver, and eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and stone alike. She carried no tools, only a small satchel of herbs and scrolls, and her presence silenced the palace for a moment, as though even the walls recognized the weight she carried. "The child is not merely sick," the healer said, her voice low and melodic, carrying the authority of someone who had walked through fire and emerged unburned. The queen's hands shook as she took in the words. Choice? What choice could a child make? The same choice every generation of this palace must make, the healer replied. She knelt beside the prince, whispering chants that made the air shimmer. The balance of life and blood is tipping. If the prince dies, the threads that bind these children together will unravel. But there is another way, a way that requires courage and sacrifice and the awakening of something within him that even he does not yet understand. Outside the nursery, the other children began to act strangely. Some huddled in corners, eyes wide with fear, as if they sensed the prince's suffering. Others, like Tariq, paced nervously, whispering of doors that open and close on their own. The silk ward had grown bolder. Its shadows seeped farther into the palace, curling along hallways, slipping beneath doors, and brushing against the children like ghostly fingers. Elara's heart ached as she watched them. She had grown attached to these children in ways she did not fully understand, and now they were all at the mercy of forces older than the palace itself. She realized, with a pang of fear, that the prophecy had not accounted for them, not for their courage, their cleverness, their bond to the prince. Night fell heavier than usual, and with it came a strange warmth around the cradle. The prince murmured in his sleep, eyes fluttering beneath closed lids, and the healer whispered urgently, her fingers tracing sigils in the air. She must awaken the ember. Only then can the curse be challenged. Only then can the children survive. Elara knew what that meant. The prince's illness was not merely physical. It was the catalyst, the spark that would ignite the next stage of the curse. And if she was to protect him and the other children, she would need to understand the word, the prophecy, and the hidden power lying dormant in the smallest prince of the palace. As the healer continued her work, the air around the cradles shimmered with an unearthly light. Shadows retreated and advanced, as if the palace itself were holding its breath, watching, waiting. Elara knelt beside the cradle, her hand hovering over the prince's small, fevered fingers. The ember within him stirred, and somewhere, deep in the silk ward, the shadows whispered with anticipation. The palace, it seemed, was no longer a home. It was a forge, and Prince Malek's life was the fire that would shape what came next. The moon rose, swollen and red, over the palace, casting long, blood-tinged shadows across the marble corridors. That night, the air carried a weight that even the seasoned guards could feel. A stillness so profound that the usual creaks and sighs of the palace seemed silenced, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Elara could feel it as she moved through the hallways, lantern in hand. The other children had begun to notice the strange pull that had haunted them for days, an almost magnetic draw toward the forbidden silk ward. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance, a toe stepping closer than intended, but now it had become impossible to ignore. Their whispers carried urgency and fear. "We shouldn't go," Tariq muttered, voice trembling. "These shadows, they watch. They know when we're near." "But we have to," Amina said, eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. "If it's connected to the prince, if it's what's making him sick, we have to understand it." Elara's hand rested on the bronze cradle. Prince Malek lay there, pale but staring,
his fever broken only for brief moments when the healer's chant seemed to push back the darkness. The healer had warned them that the celestial alignment, an event predicted once in a generation, would occur tonight. It would amplify the Silk Ward's power, bridging the world of shadows and the world of the living. As the palace bells tolled midnight, a strange wind swept through the corridors, riffling curtains and rattling doors. The heavy ebony doors of the Silk Ward, sealed for decades, trembled as though struck by an invisible hand. Then, with a groan that made the entire wing shiver, the locks fell open. A cold, almost liquid darkness spilled into the hall, curling along the floors and walls like smoke searching for warmth. Elara grabbed the hands of Tariq and Amina. "We have to follow it," she whispered, voice tight with fear and determination. "We can't let it take them, or him." The children stepped into the ward, and the world seemed to shift. Hallways stretched impossibly long, doors that should have been closed yawned open, and silk curtains swirled around them, alive with movement. Shadows writhed across the walls, whispering in a language just beyond comprehension, calling their names, tempting them deeper. The deeper they went, the more the palace seemed to warp. Elara felt the walls pulse as if they had a heartbeat. The floor beneath her feet seemed to breathe, rising and falling with each step. And then, at the heart of the ward, they saw it. A vast chamber of silk, shimmering silver under the moonlight filtering through cracks in the roof, and at its center, a dark pool that reflected not their faces, but their fears. The pool rippled, and a voice, neither male nor female, neither old nor young, whispered, "The prince is the key, the children are the flame. Choose who survives, or all will be consumed." A chill ran down Elara's spine. She realized the prophecy had been a riddle, not a warning. The ward wasn't merely a trap, it was a test, and the children, led by the smallest hands, were now the ones who must solve it. Suddenly, shadows surged from the walls, slithering toward them like serpents made of smoke. Tariq stumbled backward, Amina screamed, and Elara gritted her teeth, stepping forward. She remembered the healer's words: courage, sacrifice, awakening. She reached into the darkness with her mind, calling on some hidden strength, and the shadows recoiled, hissing as if burned. Then, from the dark pool, a figure arose, a spectral image of a child eerily resembling Prince Malek, eyes glowing with the ember that had begun to stir in him days ago. It beckoned, and Elara knew instinctively this was the part of the prince that the ward sought to claim, the ember that would decide the fate of all the children. With a deep breath, she took the first step toward the pool. "We won't let you take him," she said, voice steady despite the fear lacing it. "We'll face this together." The shadows hissed and lunged, but the children, hand in hand, pressed forward. And for the first time, the palace seemed to respond, the walls humming as if in approval, the corridors straightening, the air growing warmer. The ward was alive, yes, but it was not invincible. Tonight they had crossed the threshold. Tonight the children of the palace faced the ward, not as prey, but as challengers. And somewhere, deep within Prince Malek, the ember stirred brighter, ready to awaken. The palace had become a realm suspended between worlds. Shadows no longer clung to the walls. They surged from them, twisting and writhing, hungry and restless. Every corridor seemed alive, every doorway a trap, every whisper a threat. Yet within the heart of this storm, the children moved with purpose, their hands clasped tightly, their faces pale but resolute. Prince Malek lay in the bronze cradle at the center of the ward, the ember within him pulsing with an inner light that illuminated the swirling darkness. The healer knelt beside him, murmuring chants that resonated with the rhythm of the child's heartbeat. Ilara, her breath shallow, reached for the prince's tiny hand, feeling the warmth of life push back against the chill of the ward. The shadows shrieked, recoiling from the ember as if afraid, but they did not vanish. Instead, they surged toward the children, testing their courage, probing their fears. A spectral figure, the reflection of the prince, stepped from the black pool in the chamber's center, eyes glowing like molten gold. "You cannot save him," it hissed, voice like wind through broken glass. "He is the key. If he dies, all must die." Ilara stood taller, her resolve hardening like steel tempered in fire. "You're wrong," she said. "He is not the key. We are, and together we decide who survives." The spectral figure laughed, and the ward responded. Shadows leapt, curling around the children, forcing them to their knees, threatening to consume them entirely. Amina cried out, but Tariq, his fear tempered by determination, gripped her hand and pulled her forward. "We face it, all of us, together." The healer spoke urgently. "The ember responds to choice, to courage, to unity. He must understand his power, and you must guide him." Ilara stepped forward, her small hand touching the bronze cradle. "Malek," she whispered, "awake. You are stronger than they say. We are all here. We are your family, and we choose life together." The ember within the prince flared, a brilliant pulse of golden light that rippled through the ward, burning away tendrils of darkness. The shadows recoiled, their screeches echoing like shattered crystal. The spectral figure shrieked and dissolved into nothing, leaving only the swirling silver silk of the chamber. Malek's eyes opened fully, glowing faintly with the ember's light. For the first time, he reached out intentionally, his small hand brushing against the shadows that lingered. And they did not resist. Instead, they bowed, folding back into themselves, as if acknowledging that the ward's hunger had been met, not by sacrifice, but by courage and unity. Ilara felt tears sting her eyes as the other children gathered around the cradle. They had faced the ward, faced the prophecy, and broken the cycle that had haunted the palace for generations. The blood of the past, the generations who had bound themselves to fear and legend, had been replaced by choice and bravery. The healer arose, her eyes bright with a mixture of relief and awe. "The curse is broken," she said softly, "not through death, but through understanding. The ember burned strongest when it is nurtured, not feared." The palace exhaled. The corridors no longer pulsed with menace. The doors remained still. The shadows receded into harmless patterns along the walls. The silk ward, long a place of dread, shimmered in peaceful silver, a monument to the power of courage and connection. Prince Malek sat up, small hands resting on the edge of the cradle, and smiled at Ilara and the other children. For the first time, the prophecy's weight no longer hung over them. It had promised death, but in its place, they had forged life. And as dawn crept through the palace windows, gilding the marble in warm light, Ilara realized that the palace had changed, not just the walls, not just the wards, but the hearts of all who dwelt within. Shadows could still linger, but they were no longer chains. They were reminders. The greatest power lay not in prophecy or fear, but in choice, courage, and the bond that tied the children to one another. The children stepped into the corridors together. Laughter and whispers replaced fear. The prince followed, tiny steps carrying the ember of hope, and the palace, for the first time in generations, felt alive, not as a prison of shadows, but as a home that had survived. The blood oath of the past had been broken.